Even if you never venture down the path of creating your own macros in Microsoft Project, you'll still need to set your security settings to deal with files that arrive that already contain macros. Now, the macros we've looked at and used have been quite useful, but anybody with any proper knowledge of Visual Basic could create a macro that could damage your file system. For that reason, the security settings are vitally important. Now, to visit your security settings and therefore make a change, we go to View, across the macros, and in the drop list you can see Macro Security. The macro security settings tell Microsoft Project how to deal with project files that you open that contain macros. We can either choose the most strict option, which is the top one, disable all macros without notification. So it will disable any macros within a file, but not actually tell you it's disabled them. Option 2 is to disable all the macros, but to tell you. So it'll say, I'm disabling the macros in this project, and actually give you an option to enable them at that stage. We can disable all macros except those that are digitally signed, or the lowest security setting and not recommended, and it says that here, not recommended, is to enable all macros. So it won't tell you if there are any macros, it'll just enable them. And if that macro happens to be, let's call it a naughty macro, then it will be in your system doing whatever it feels like doing. So we're going to stay with the probably safest option, which is disable the macros, but to tell you it's disable the macros and therefore give you an option to enable them. Once you've decided on your settings, you simply click OK. If we then go and try and open a file with macros, so the working file project with macro would be a good choice. And because we've asked it to disable them but to notify us, we get this little security notice. Microsoft Office has identified a potential security concern. Macros have been disabled because they might contain viruses or other security hazards. Do not enable this content unless you trust the source of the file. So if you know who sent you the file and you know the macro is going to be quite useful, or it might even be a macro you've created, then you can enable the macros. If you're not sure, then the advice will be to disable the macros. And you can see the default there is disabled. This is the button that has the focus. I'm going to enable the macros. Within my file, I can then go to macros, view macros, and I will see the one that's in this particular file is project with macro, insert meeting, and I can run the macro and it runs quite happily and creates me a 2-hour meeting. If I close the file and not save the changes, and then attempt to reopen it, so I'm opening the same file, I get the same dialog box. Microsoft Project does not recall that I actually allowed the macros to be enabled last time. It asks me again, so every time I open this file, I will get the same dialog box. There isn't an option to remember that this file has its macros enabled and any other doesn't. However, this time let's go with the default. I don't know this file. I don't know the author. I'm going to disable the macros. Then when I go to macros, view macros, if I try to choose the one that exists in this file, I find I cannot run it. It's totally grayed out because the macro has been disabled. At that point, I could see the name of the macro. I could even click into edit and see what the macro is doing. So decide at that stage whether it's a safe macro, and I can see this one just inserts a task and sets a few values. Nothing too dangerous there. And I could then close the Visual Basic editor, close the file, reopen it, and then when presented with the dialog box, I can click enable because I've actually checked the code and I can see it's not doing anything that would affect my file system. So if you don't know the author, you can disable the macros, then look at the code for the macros and make your own decision on whether it's safe or not. At that stage, you can close the file, reopen it, and enable the macros. So the macro security settings are important that you check what your settings are, even if you yourself are not going to create any macros. And the default, sort of safest option is to disable them, but with notification. Definitely do not enable all macros. And if you go right to the other end and disable all macros, but without notification, then you won't know what you're missing. You won't know what macros might be there of any use.